December 24th, 1944, off the coast of Antwerp. The night sky was burning. Flak bursts glimmered like malignant constellations above the frozen harbor, tracing ghostly flowers of light across the darkness. Allied gunners manned their stations in the biting cold, their breath fogging beneath steel helmets dusted with frost. Below them, the docks were jammed with Liberty ships, fuel barges, and ammunition freighters, the lifeline of the armies pushing east after D-Day. Sergeant James Red Talbot of the 474th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion squinted through his binoculars. He'd seen V-1 buzz bombs before, ugly, sputtering things, their pulse jets roaring like chainsaws, but nothing like this. The radar operator's voice crackled in his headset. Multiple tracks inbound, low and fast, coming from the coast. Talbot's stomach knotted. The Germans had started their Christmas gift early. It was the beginning of Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's desperate bid to claw back control of the skies over the Western Front. The gunners braced. They knew the drill. Calculate lead, adjust elevation, squeeze the trigger, hope to see a black puff somewhere near the streaking enemy plane. It was always guesswork. Too soon, and the shell detonated harmlessly below. Too late, and it burst in empty sky. But this time, something different was waiting inside those 90mm shells. Fire mission! Fuse type VT! The command echoed down the gun line. The loaders slammed in fresh ammunition. Each round now carried a secret, a small glass bulb and miniature radio transmitter, sealed and wired to detect the unseen. As the guns thundered, invisible waves pulsed from the shells, searching for metal. When reflected energy came back strong enough, boom, the fuse triggered itself. Within seconds, the sky changed. The first German fighter broke through the clouds, its engine howling. A flak shell exploded not beside it, but directly in front of its nose, a perfect mid-air detonation that shattered the cockpit and tore the wings apart. The crew on the ground stood frozen for a moment. They'd never seen such precision. It wasn't luck, it was something new. Lieutenant Robert Keane, the battery commander, couldn't help but grin. "They think we're magicians," he muttered, watching another Messerschmitt vanish in a burst of fire. "Let them." Below, sailors on the piers cheered as more planes fell, spiraling like flaming comets into the black water. The men didn't know the details, only that their guns had suddenly become unerring. What they were witnessing was the combat debut of one of the war's most closely guarded secrets, the VT, Variable Time Fuse, better known as the proximity fuse. It was a technological marvel, an invention so advanced that even many officers using it didn't fully understand how it worked. While the Germans had poured resources into massive rockets and jet planes, the Allies had quietly revolutionized something far smaller, the shell itself. Inside a casing no wider than a coffee mug was a miniature radar, a vacuum tube oscillator, a power source, and a tiny brain capable of measuring reflected radio waves in microseconds. The fuse could see its target and decide when to explode. As more bombers approached Antwerp, the new shells filled the sky with disciplined fury. Each burst was closer, tighter, more lethal. The Luftwaffe pilots, already exhausted from months of retreat, couldn't believe what they were seeing. They'd flown through flak before, erratic, wild, terrifying, but survivable. Now, it was as if the Allied guns had learned to aim themselves. By midnight, more than a dozen German aircraft had been destroyed over the harbor. Talbot's hands trembled as he fed another shell into the breach. "Jesus," he whispered, "it's like the shells know where to go." Keane glanced up at the glowing sky and said quietly, "Maybe they do." Across the channel, British radar stations were reporting similar success. V-1 flying bombs, Hitler's so-called revenge weapons, were being plucked from the air before they reached London. Searchlights caught only the debris, engines spinning into the Thames, wings cartwheeling into the countryside. Each intercepted buzz bomb meant lives saved, homes spared, and a message to Berlin. The age of mechanical warfare had given birth to electronic defense. But even then, the men firing the guns didn't know how fragile the secret was. The proximity fuse was so classified that any shell that failed to detonate was to be destroyed on sight, buried, blown up, or lost to the sea. No chance for Axis engineers to recover even a fragment. The Germans were never allowed to study one, and so they never understood why their aircraft started dying in patterns that defied logic. By Christmas morning, the guns around Antwerp fell silent. Smoke hung over the harbor, and the city's church bells rang faintly through the frost. In the mess tent, Keane poured himself a cup of coffee and read the after-action report. Enemy losses, 17 aircraft confirmed. Own losses, none. He exhaled slowly. Maybe, he said, half to himself, we just changed the sky. What he didn't know was that the story of the proximity fuse began years earlier, not in Europe, but in secret laboratories scattered across the United States and Britain, where physicists, engineers, and naval officers had waged their own invisible war of invention. It was a war of circuits, not bullets, and it would become one of the most decisive scientific battles of the 20th century. It began in 1940, a time when the future of civilization balanced on a knife's edge. Britain stood alone. France had fallen. London was burning nightly. And across the Atlantic, the United States was still officially at peace. Yet inside a nondescript set of brick buildings at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, a small group of scientists was quietly redefining the rules of war. They called it the Applied Physics Laboratory, or simply the APL. Its mission, to solve the Navy's most impossible problems. Among them was one that had plagued every gun crew since the dawn of anti-aircraft warfare: how to hit a fast, high, and distant target with a shell that couldn't be guided once fired. One man, Merle Tuve, a physicist from the Carnegie Institution, took the challenge personally. Tall, spectacled, and methodical, Tuve believed that electronics could do what gunners' eyes never could: measure distance automatically. He proposed an audacious idea: a fuse that could sense when it was near a target and explode by itself. At the time, it sounded like science fiction. Mechanical fuses depended on impact or timers. Both were unreliable against aircraft. But Tuve envisioned a radio fuse, a shell that emitted radio waves, waited for them to bounce off metal, and detonated when the echo grew strong enough. In essence, he wanted to build a radar small enough to fit inside an artillery shell fired at 2,000 feet per second. Colleagues laughed. Some said it couldn't survive the launch. The forces of acceleration alone could crush steel, let alone fragile glass vacuum tubes. Others said it would take decades to miniaturize the electronics, but Tuve refused to back down. "Gentlemen," he told the Navy liaison, "if you can put a man in an airplane at 20,000 feet, we can put a brain in a shell." The project was approved, barely, under the codename VT, Variable Time. By 1941, hundreds of scientists were working in secrecy across university basements, naval labs, and industrial plants. The stakes were enormous. If the fuse worked, it could turn every flak shell into a near certainty. If it failed, millions of dollars and months of precious time would be lost. Progress came slowly, painfully. In one early test, the tiny radio inside the fuse simply vaporized from the shock of firing. The next prototype survived the launch but triggered prematurely, bursting dangerously close to friendly positions. There were explosions, fires, and more than a few singed eyebrows. Yet each failure brought them closer to something that had never existed before, a weapon that could think. By mid-1942, the breakthrough came not in a gleaming laboratory, but on the windswept Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. A Navy crew loaded prototype shells into a 5-inch gun aimed at a target drone towed miles offshore and fired. The observers held their breath. One shell burst close enough to shear a wing clean off the drone. The men erupted in cheers. Against all odds, the electronics had survived. The fuse had worked. What followed was an engineering marathon. The fuse had to be mass-producible, reliable, and idiot-proof. Each one contained over 100 parts, hand-assembled by workers, many of them women, under magnifying glasses in sealed rooms to prevent contamination. The precision was staggering. Every vacuum tube had to withstand 20,000 Gs of acceleration, equivalent to hitting a wall at Mach 3. Each fuse had to arm itself safely after firing, generate its own electrical power by spinning an internal generator, and remain stable in temperature extremes, from the Arctic to the Pacific. It was more than a weapon. It was a miracle of applied science. By 1943, the first shipments reached the U.S. Navy's Pacific Fleet under absolute secrecy. The sailors were told almost nothing, only that they were to guard the ammunition as if it were gold. The order came directly from Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations, and from Vannevar Bush, head of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, who feared what would happen if the enemy ever captured one. The fuses were marked VT and stored in sealed crates. They were not to be fired over land, lest unexploded shells fall into enemy hands. The first operational test came late that same year, somewhere in the Solomon Islands. A Japanese dive bomber made a run on a U.S. destroyer. The gun crews fired a few VT rounds. The shell exploded, not near, not behind, but directly beside the attacker's fuselage. The plane disintegrated before it could even release its bomb. The destroyer's gunnery officer radioed back a single sentence: "The fuse works beautifully." From that point forward, the Allies held a weapon the Axis couldn't match. At Bougainville, Saipan, and later Okinawa, U.S. Navy ships faced waves of Japanese aircraft, including suicide attackers diving from the clouds at terrifying speed. Conventional flak had struggled to stop them. A single miss meant disaster. But now, with proximity fuses, every round that came within 50 feet of its target detonated automatically. The effect was devastating. Kamikaze pilots never stood a chance. Admiral Chester Nimitz later called the VT fuse the most important new development in the Pacific since radar. Even General George S. Patton, whose tanks were pounding through Belgium at the time, wrote to Washington, "The new fuses make our artillery almost 100% effective. I would hate to be on the receiving end." In Europe, proximity fuses began to appear in ground artillery shells by late 1944. During the Battle of the Bulge, they were used for the first time in snow-shrouded forests, programmed to detonate above the treetops. The airbursts tore through German infantry, producing carnage unseen since Verdun. One German survivor later described it bitterly: "The Americans have shells that see us coming." Yet amid the triumph, secrecy remained absolute. No fuse could fall intact into enemy hands. Crews were instructed to detonate unused ammunition if capture was imminent. Not one proximity fuse ever reached German or Japanese scientists during the war, a miracle of discipline and luck. By the time Sergeant Talbot and his battery opened fire over Antwerp that Christmas Eve, the technology had matured into a production line miracle. Tens of millions of fuses assembled, shipped, and fired. What began as a physicist's impossible dream had become one of the great equalizers of modern warfare, a fusion of science, bravery, and precision that turned the very air itself into a weapon. And the men who fired those shells never forgot the first night they saw the sky explode on their side. April 6, 1945, Okinawa. The largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War was underway, and so was the largest aerial suicide attack in history. The U.S. Navy's radar screens were crowded with incoming echoes. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft, Zeros, Oscars, Vals, even obsolete trainers packed with explosives were converging on the invasion fleet from every direction. The code name for their assault was Kikusui, floating chrysanthemums, but to the men below, it was pure chaos. On the deck of the USS Missouri, the battleship's 5-inch 38 caliber guns rotated skyward with a metallic groan. Beneath their armor, gun crews sweated in the dim red light, the air thick with the smell of cordite and oil. Ammunition handlers shouted above the noise, "Load VT fuses, repeat VT." It was the first time in naval history that every major ship carried the new weapon in quantity. The proximity fuse had already proven deadly in testing and defense, but now, over Okinawa, it would face its ultimate trial. The first kamikazes broke through the clouds just after noon, diving directly into the gunfire. The ocean erupted in flame. Every Allied ship within 20 miles joined in, filling the sky with hundreds of black blossoms of bursting flak. But unlike the old days, this wasn't random. The new shells detonated exactly when they sensed aluminum or steel, detecting the aircraft as it exploded at just the right distance to shred wings, rupture fuel tanks, and slice through flesh with invisible shrapnel. Pilots who once trusted in speed and luck now found death waiting for them mid-dive, long before they reached their targets. From his position on the USS Bunker Hill, Seaman First Class William Tex Chambers watched through binoculars as a Japanese Zero burst apart in a perfectly timed explosion, fragments tumbling like confetti into the waves. "It's like the damn sky learned to shoot," he muttered to his gun captain. The officer simply nodded, eyes fixed on the next target. For days, the attacks came in waves. Hundreds of kamikazes hurled themselves toward the fleet, desperate, fearless, and guided by nothing but faith. Yet the losses were catastrophic. Radar picket destroyers equipped with VT-fused 5-inch guns cut down attackers before they reached their final dives. The air above Okinawa was thick with smoke and shredded aluminum. Journalists who witnessed it from carriers described it as a mechanical storm, black bursts timed with surgical precision, each one erasing a plane. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Fifth Fleet, later said, "The proximity fuse made all the difference. Without it, the kamikaze would have broken our backbone." Over the course of the campaign, more than 3,000 Japanese aircraft were launched in suicide attacks. Nearly half were destroyed by anti-aircraft fire, the majority by shells using proximity fuses. The defenders' accuracy had multiplied almost overnight. Gunners who once needed a dozen shots to down one plane were now averaging 1 or 2. The results were visible on every deck, smoking wreckage drifting down, explosions just beyond reach, and cheers erupting as the sky itself seemed to protect the fleet. Yet the psychological shift was just as important as the tactical one. For years, sailors had fought under the shadow of helplessness, the terrifying knowledge that no matter how fiercely they fired, one bomber slipping through could end hundreds of lives. But now they had something close to confidence. Every man at the gun knew that his next round might count. The morale of entire task forces shifted in a single campaign. On April 16th, during the second major Kikusui wave, the USS Laffey, a destroyer known as the ship that would not die, was hit repeatedly by kamikazes and bombs. Yet for every plane that struck, proximity-fused shells destroyed 2 more. Crewmen later said the sea around them was a graveyard of burning planes. Lieutenant Commander Frederick Julian Beckton, the ship's captain, later wrote in his after-action report, "The VT fuses functioned flawlessly under the most intense combat conditions. Without them, we would not have survived." But the weapon's success carried a shadow. Each shell was a technological masterpiece, and each detonation a mystery to the men who fired it. Few sailors truly understood how a metal casing the size of a soda bottle could sense distance in microseconds. To them, it was simply the magic fuse. In the rare quiet moments after battle, they'd sit on deck and talk. Some wondered if the device gave off light or sound. Others joked it had a little man inside with a stopwatch. The truth, that it contained a miniature radar with classified above top secret. Only a handful of officers and scientists knew its real nature. One evening, as the sun bled orange over Okinawa's smoky horizon, Tex Chambers turned to his gun captain and asked, "Sir, how do they know when to go off?" The captain stared out to sea for a long moment before answering, "They just know, Tex. That's all you need to know." Even the Japanese noticed. Intelligence officers reported that Allied flak had become unusually precise, with shells bursting as if guided by invisible radio control. Captured pilots spoke of terror, of seeing entire formations vanish in a single volley, their aircraft shredded mid-air. Some refused to fly again. But there was no way for Japan to reproduce it. Their industry, crippled by bombing and blockade, couldn't match the intricate manufacturing that the U.S. had developed. Even if they'd found an unexploded fuse, they lacked the vacuum tube technology small and rugged enough to survive gunfire. The secret remained intact until war's end. By the time Okinawa was secured in June 1945, proximity fuses had destroyed more enemy aircraft than any other single Allied invention, except radar itself. The Pacific Fleet had endured the deadliest kamikaze campaign of the war, and survived. In the months that followed, the weapon's influence spread even further. Artillery units on Okinawa began experimenting with ground bursts against dug-in positions. Officers reported devastating airburst effects, a precursor to the tactics that would dominate modern warfare. As word filtered back to Washington, President Harry Truman was briefed on the results. "The VT fuse," his aide told him, "may have saved more ships than we can count." Truman later remarked privately that it stood among the top scientific achievements of the war, beside radar, the atomic bomb, and penicillin. And yet, to the men who had fired them, the sailors and gunners who watched the sky come alive with fire, it remained a simple miracle, a small humming secret that had changed the very nature of battle. As Okinawa's beaches fell silent and the last Japanese airfields were reduced to ash, one exhausted gunner wrote in his diary, "We fired until our hands bled. The shells burst before the planes even reached us. It felt like the air itself was fighting back. Maybe that's what victory sounds like. Thunder that answers back." August 15th, 1945. Tokyo Bay. The war was finally over. Emperor Hirohito's voice had crackled over the radio just days earlier, surrendering unconditionally. Now, as American warships filled the bay, flags snapping in the humid wind, a quiet sense of disbelief swept through the crews. It was done. Yet below decks, in storerooms and magazines, thousands of sealed crates sat untouched, marked with 2 simple letters, VT. To most, they meant nothing. To those who knew, they represented one of the war's greatest secrets. Aboard the USS Missouri, the same ship where the surrender would soon be signed, Chief Gunner's Mate Harold Jensen stood watch beside the magazines. He'd fired hundreds of proximity-fused shells during Okinawa. Now, as peace settled over the Pacific, he couldn't help but wonder what would become of the miracle that had saved them all. He didn't know it yet, but the VT Fuze would outlive the war and quietly redefine the battlefield for generations to come. The invention's post-war legacy began almost immediately. When Allied scientists finally declassified their wartime research, the scope of the achievement stunned even those inside the military. Between 1942 and 1945, American industry had produced more than 22 million proximity fuses, a feat of mass production rivaled only by the Manhattan Project. Factories in Ohio, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania had employed thousands of workers, many of them women, assembling the delicate devices by hand under strict secrecy. Each fuse was tested, inspected, and stamped with codes that revealed nothing of its function. Even within the workforce, rumors abounded. Some thought they were building parts for radios. Others believed they were crafting timing mechanisms for bombs. Very few ever learned that their handiwork had changed the course of naval warfare. At war's end, Vannevar Bush, head of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, addressed the White House Science Committee. If the atomic bomb ended the war, the proximity fuse saved the world that would fight it. But the fuse's impact extended far beyond the sea. In Europe, it had already proven its ground capability during the Battle of the Bulge, when American artillery fired VT shells into attacking German infantry near Bastogne. Traditional time fuses detonated after fixed intervals. They were easy to miscalculate. But proximity fuses exploded just above the enemy, showering fragments downward like steel rain. The results were devastating. German survivors described the attacks as curtains of fire that hung in the air. General Patton called it the most effective artillery innovation since powder. By 1945, proximity fuses were being tested for anti-tank mines, depth charges, and even air-dropped bombs. The principle, sensing distance and reacting instantly, unlocked a new way of thinking, weapons that could perceive. The same miniature radio circuitry that had once detected aircraft now inspired peacetime engineers designing radar altimeters, guided missiles, and the first electronic triggers for spaceflight. A secret born from necessity had quietly ignited the age of precision. In the post-war years, the technology's guardianship passed from the hands of gunners to those of scientists. At the newly formed Naval Ordnance Laboratory, physicists dismantled wartime fuses and rebuilt them with transistors, replacing vacuum tubes with solid-state circuits. The result was lighter, smaller, and infinitely more reliable. By the Korean War in the early 1950s, U.S. forces were once again firing proximity-fused artillery, this time at enemy positions in the mountains of the peninsula. The same principle held true: detonate above, not within. The airburst effect forced opponents out of cover, neutralizing hidden troops. It was the first glimpse of the future battlefield, one where sensors, not soldiers' eyes, decided when to strike. But none of that could be known to the weary sailors sailing home in 1945. For them, the miracle remained invisible. In ports from San Francisco to Norfolk, proximity-fused shells were offloaded, inventoried, and locked away under armed guard. Secrecy persisted even in victory. When the USS Missouri hosted the Japanese surrender on September 2, 1945, the men on deck had no idea that deep below their feet lay a weapon more complex than anything afloat. The proximity fuse never appeared in the victory speeches, never on propaganda posters, never in the newsreels. Its silence was deliberate, because its design would soon be the foundation for the missile age. In the years that followed, fragments of its story began to leak out. In 1946, the U.S. Navy finally declassified the project, and journalists were astonished. Time magazine called it a shell that thinks. The New York Times described it as a triumph of invisible warfare. Scientists like Merle Tuve, once anonymous, were suddenly hailed as heroes. When asked how he felt about his creation, Tuve simply said, "We weren't trying to make something deadly. We were trying to make something precise. The fewer shells it takes to end a war, the fewer men die." That philosophy, precision over power, would define the rest of the 20th century. The same lineage of design led to radar-guided missiles, proximity-triggered nuclear warheads, and satellite-borne sensors that could see the curvature of the Earth. Every smart weapon, every laser-guided bomb, every autonomous defense system traces its ancestry to the first shell that could think for itself. Yet for all its future influence, the proximity fuse's most enduring legacy remained human. Ask any veteran gunner of the Pacific what he remembered most, and you'd hear the same story told with awe. The night the sky fought back. The first time flak exploded, not in blind fury, but in perfect synchrony. The moment when they realized that the tide of war had turned, not because of numbers, but because of understanding. Sergeant Talbot, the man who'd stood shivering on the gun line outside Antwerp that frozen night in 1944, returned home to Ohio after the war. He married, had children, and rarely spoke of his service. But years later, when his grandson asked him what the war looked like, Talbot simply smiled and said, "It looked like fireworks that answered you back." The proximity fuse had changed warfare forever. Yet its greatest triumph was invisible, measured not in explosions, but in the lives it quietly saved. In every shell that found its target before the enemy could, there was a fragment of human ingenuity, the heartbeat of science harnessed to defend, not destroy. In the echo of every mid-air detonation was the end of an era when chance ruled the battlefield, and the beginning of one where intelligence would. The world had entered the electronic age, and the little glass bulb inside a shell had lit the way.